This is Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Hello, I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue, media specialist for the LFA. In Minding the Forest, we talk about forestry, the importance of managing forests, and many aspects about the forest products industry in Louisiana. Landowners, loggers, and manufacturers all play an important role in keeping our forests healthy, which helps clean our air and filter our water. This episode of Minding the Forest is sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit Office, or you can find them online at firstsouthland.com. Our topic in this episode is urban forestry. Yes, there are forests in urban settings. We have two guests today, Darren Green, who is the urban forester for the city of Alexandria, Louisiana, and Paul Johnson, who is with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI. We have with us today Darren Green. Darren is a landscape architect, or his title is Landscape Architect and Urban Forester for the city of Alexandria, Louisiana. Darren, great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
And on the phone today we have Paul Johnson. Paul is Vice President, Urban and Community Forestry and Career Pathways for the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, otherwise known as SFI. Paul, thanks for joining us on the phone today.
Happy to be here.
Okay, let's start a little bit by finding out who these folks are. Darren, I have you in studio, so we'll pick on you first. Tell us a little about yourself and what you do.
So I'm the urban forester, landscape architect for the city of Alexandria. I have been in that position for 23 years. Prior to that, I was a private practice landscape architect and did that for about 5 years. And prior to that, I worked for Baton Rouge Green, which is a nonprofit tree advocacy group in Baton Rouge. And that was my first job out of college. So I have degrees in both horticulture and landscape architecture, and I actually took a few forestry classes. So
that would be important.
Yes, somewhat of a cosmopolitan, scattered approach to my education. I often tell people that if someone would pay my bills, I would have stayed in college forever. I really loved it and consider myself a lifelong learner. So this position came up with the city. They had hired someone with an arboricultural background, and they were in that position about 3 years, and it just wasn't a good fit. So they asked me to apply for the position. I did, and have basically built that program from scratch.
Cool. Paul, tell us a little about yourself. Where are you from, and how was your path to get to SFI?
Yeah, so I am speaking to you from Austin, Texas. So I always like to take a moment and just acknowledge those that came before us also. There's a lot of indigenous people, tribal people that have been vital for us being where we are. So I'm in Austin now, grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've been with SFI for about 3.5 years now. Started out as the director of urban and community forestry, and the role's grown a little bit since then. Prior to that, I was with the state of Texas in state forestry, so Texas A&M Forest Service. Started out as a regional urban forester and eventually kind of took over and was able to run the program as the program leader. Before that, I also had kind of a diverse approach, which I think is very common in urban forestry. So went to Oklahoma State University, got a degree in forestry, which is at that time a very traditional forestry program, did some state forestry, ended up in landscaping and tree care. That's when I became a certified arborist. and started kind of looking around, spent a bit of time with the cooperative extension program in Oklahoma, running the Master Gardener program, that kind of thing, before eventually moving to Texas. And I came to SFI because, and we can probably talk about this a little bit more, but SFI has been active in traditional forestry standard certification for more than 2 decades. And they started exploring, what if we brought that concept, that tool, to urban and community forestry? They decided to do that, and so they floated the position, and I was lucky enough to get it. Wasn't that far from being able to qualify for retirement at the state, but this was such a unique opportunity that I just had to jump in and really try it out. So I think that a number of things in my career have been really vital. ISA and their certification program, and then the other is MFI, the Municipal Forestry Institute, which is actually where Darren and I met back in 2008.
Good. So y'all known each other for quite some time, it seems.
Yeah, and
it's amazing how long it's been, isn't it, Darren?
it is, and interestingly, we were talking off air before this about that program, and for me, that leadership development program was kind of a pivotal trajectory change in my career, at least in my perception of my career.
Paul, talk a little bit about SFI. We've had Gordy Mao, who is with SFI. Talked to him a little over a year ago or so. And so I think it's important just to get out what SFI is, what it is, the philosophy, and then if you can kind of roll that into how, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, but how did urban forestry fit in with what the goals SFI has?
So the mission of SFI is to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaboration. It's really about all of us working together towards that common goal. And our vision is a world that values and benefits from sustainably managed forests. And I always add to that, no matter where they lie. So we have a spectrum from rural to urban, and where there are trees, that's all forest. And so for a little over 25 years now, SFI has kind of managed the sector developed creation of the forest management standard, and then they've added chain of custody, they added fiber sourcing, so several standards kind of throughout that time to increase our ability to advance sustainability through those forest-focused collaborations. And in the last update to those standards, they started exploring, should we do the same thing in urban and community forestry? That question, I guess, had been asked kind of off and on, but in that 2020 to 2021, when they were really working on the 2022 update, they put together a task group to explore. And so you may have heard of Katie Fernholz from the U.S. and then Peter Dunker from Canada were the co-chairs of that exploration. They looked around to see if anybody else was doing that. And there's not really anybody else in the world that has taken that standard and certification process and applied it in urban and community forestry. They did a great job of also engaging with the sector, and ended up getting over 600 people that responded to a survey asking, should SFI enter into this space? And the overwhelming answer, like 90% of the participants, said yes. We'd love to have SFI bring this tool to our sector. And so they went to the board. The board had some pretty amazing representation on it, including Dan Lamb with Arbor Day Foundation, JAD with American Forest. And so the board said, yes, let's invest in this and see if we can't increase the footprint of where we have an impact by being able to work with an audience that maybe we haven't worked well with before, other than being able to have SFI certified products that people are buying and using. And so they floated the position. And because it is the first, it was just an extremely unique opportunity for me in my career. I'll kind of echo what Darren said. MFI in 2008 had a profound impact on me and my career. And I don't think I'd be here speaking to you from this role if it hadn't been for that. The ability to see that bigger picture, to see how all of the different moving pieces connect with each other, and how we really can benefit from sustainably managed forests was just very important for me. I earned my ISA municipal specialist very soon after MFI. Since then, I've become a board certified master arborist, certified forester with SAF, certified urban and community forester with SAF. And so each of these blocks have kind of built upon my ability to hopefully make a difference in the world through trees. And I think it's important that when you look at SFI coming into urban and community forestry, that we did it with really the biggest partners in urban and community forestry: Arbor Day Foundation, American Forest, Tree Canada, ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, and SMA, now UCFS, Urban and Community Forest Society, the owners of and originators of MFI. And so I think it just goes to show that it's a really big world, but it's honestly kind of a small sector. Urban and community forestry as such is really only 40, 50, 60 years old as a practice, as a profession. And so we're able to dive in and do some things that have a real impact on where people live, work, play, worship, learn, all of those things, where the majority of us are.
It's interesting that SFI, and you'll see that logo on paper bags, you'll see it on lumber, you'll see it on many forest products nowadays. So you know that somewhere in someone's forest, they have practiced sustainable, best management practices, things of that nature. And now you have a product on the shelf. How is urban forestry approached? What do you do what makes urban forestry, outside of the fact that you're in an urban area, forestry?
It's really the same process. You need to know what you have. You need to have a plan on how you're going to manage it, all the way to what do you do with that tree when it eventually has to come down. And so forestry, the biggest difference is kind of what are the primary management goals, or to be blunt, is there a product involved? But think about it. A lot of rural forests are managed for water production or for recreation. And so it doesn't really vary as much, other than, I think, more of that traditional view of forestry, something that we do out where not very many people live. I love to talk about urban forestry as gateway forestry, that it's a lot easier for somebody that has grown up in Houston, New York, LA, to understand and value forestry if they understand, the trees in my backyard or along my street at my local park need to be managed and cared for. And that way, if we do it there where it's immediate, they can see it, they can understand it, then it's so much easier for them to understand it and value it where they for our traditional SFI certified organizations is they are going to have even greater social license to do what they need to do because people are going to better understand what they're doing.
That is a very interesting concept because as we do outreach for our local SIC, and it is a goal to reach more urban areas because they most often will drive along interstate and see the forests either, right after they've been cut, after they've been thinned, and they don't have any concept of what happens between and what happens at the end when forests are clear cut and then replanted. There's no real concept of that. So that bringing that idea is really, really interesting to do. I thought hats off to SFI to doing that. Darren, what about in your experience in the city of Alexandria, Louisiana? How do you approach that? How did you try and give that concept of sustainable forestry or managed forests in an urban setting?
Well, so if you think about traditionally the profession of arboriculture, which has been around a long time, that profession typically deals with specific trees in a specific location with a specific problem. And what they have not done is made the connection between my tree and your tree and Paul's trees and everyone else's trees and looked at them as an ecosystem. So that's really the biggest difference between kind of the arboricultural or approach and the forestry or urban forestry approach is you have to look at not the trees, but the forest. And back to what Paul was saying, if in traditional forestry, yes, there is a focus on the product, but if you think about urban forestry, we have a great product. We have oxygen. We have, which we definitely need. We have, stormwater retention. They hold the soil together. Shade. My God, the last few years, if they've taught us anything, we definitely need shade. So
last year,
drought and
heat wave, yes,
exactly. So no, we're not growing trees typically in urban areas that are used for a 2x4 that you're going to buy at your local lumber store. But the benefits, I would argue, are as important, if not more important, especially for people who live in urban areas who never have access to nature or, the wild, what we would call a true traditional forest.
Yeah. We have forest awareness twice a year that LFA promotes and has for fifth graders in Rapides Parish. What we found is some of the students that come out are just amazed to be in a forest, and it's not far from their home. And probably the biggest concentration of trees they're familiar with is maybe City Park or something like that. So it is an eye-opening thing to them. I do grasp the concept of what Darren's saying as far as the products per se, more benefits, as he said. Is there an opportunity for any forest product from trees growing in an urban area?
Absolutely. If you look at the assessments that the U.S. Forest Service has done, like on an annual basis, more biomass comes down in urban forests than is harvested from the national forest. And so I think that it's a delicate balance because there are some people out there that I think are afraid that we're going to start picking the tree species that we plant for a 20 or 30 year rotation in our city parks. And that's not what we're talking about, but we are talking about sustainability. And to have a sustainable urban forest you need to know what to do with those trees when they need to come down, because trees are not permanent. Even the oldest trees that live only live for hundreds or thousands of years. And so when a tree does need to come out for risk reduction or for the development process, what can we do with that tree that has the greatest value to us? In some cases, that greatest value is habitat and leaving some large woody debris in the natural areas in our town for habitat. In other cases, it may be chipping it up to put mulch down around our other trees. One of the best things you can do to care for your trees, or you could compost it and create some additional nutrients for our trees. Or in a lot of cases, we're now seeing artisans do amazing, beautiful work, bowls and pens and slabs that turn into great value. And so I think that that is something for us. And one of the things that the standard does include is urban and community wood utilization to really help with that full cycle management of the urban forest. And if it creates some value in that process, that helps to maintain the sustainability of that urban forest economically too.
Darren, how do you look at the landscape of a city, in your case, Alexandria, and in thinking sustainability, you know you're going to lose some trees. Storms always come. And like Paul said, the risk factor is there. We have power lines that trees often fall onto. How do you look at the scope of the city and say, okay, I know that these trees are, I don't know if it's the correct term or not, but aging out or maybe cause a greater risk, and make sure that those trees are replaced, replanting like it would be in the rural area?
Yeah, so we do that two different ways. One is you have to look at both the micro scale, so within a neighborhood or maybe within a yard, and make sure that you have a diversity in both species and age classes of trees. And we have a challenge here in Alexandria. So we have what's called a garden district, which is a part of the city that developed around the turn of the century. We had a huge growth spurt. And so most of those houses are now 100 to 120 years old.
Just to be clear, it's the turn of the 20th century,
right,
not the 21st
right,
century.
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure.
That's why I'm not a timekeeper. So all of those trees were planted just because our city was a agricultural field before it was developed. So we have all these, 100 to 120 year old water oaks and pines and things that were planted, and yes, they are aging out. And so one of the big concerns is, as people take those trees down, are they going to replant with what I call canopy trees instead of, crepe myrtles and vitex and little play trees that really don't provide near as many benefits.
They look pretty ornamentals, but not necessarily
correct
the benefits that a larger tree could use.
And we know from Dave Nowak's work with the U.S. Forest Service that you really should always plant the biggest tree that you can plant within a space, because the benefits go up exponentially on those larger trees. The other way we look at it is just from citywide is to always try to have diversity. Again, in species, in age class, and a lot of that just organically, naturally happens if people are planting trees. Mm-hmm. If they're not, then it's not going to happen. So that's our approach.
Paul, what about from your standpoint when you're looking at an urban area from SFI standpoint? What sort of advice, what sort of direction do you help with in planning to improve an area like New Orleans or Baton Rouge even to establish a canopy for an urban area?
Yes. So our standard includes 16 objectives. So it's because the urban forest is complex, so is the urban standard. But it really comes down for us. We're looking at things. Objective 1 is community people and indigenous participation. Objective 2 is human health and well-being. Then we move into protection and conservation of biodiversity. So we really start out heavy on the objectives that are really the why. Why do we want trees and forests where we live, work, and play? We want them because of the great things that they do that we can benefit from. Then we move into more of the assessment, management, those kinds of things. And so within our planning objective, we're looking at, okay, are you doing a tree by tree inventory, or are you looking from the top down to see what are the extent of the community that is covered by trees? We know that things like Darren mentioned, shade, heat is one of the biggest killers that we deal with in terms of natural disasters. We always think of hurricanes and tornadoes and those other big named events. But because heat is more pervasive, tends to be a longer term, less of an acute event that we don't name or haven't until recently been naming, we don't think about it. But year in and year out, on average, more people die from heat than the other natural disasters. Well, trees are one of those first line defenses. As they are evaporating the water through their leaves, they are physically cooling the air. So it is cooler in the shade of a tree than it is in the shade of an awning. That's why when you go and sit outside at a restaurant and they've got misters going, it's that same idea. They're trying to mimic what nature does so effectively and efficiently.
Cool.
Well, the trees, the air, the water, the animals, they don't understand political boundaries. They don't recognize political boundaries. So it is a spectrum from there on Bourbon Street all the way out to the rural forest. You have a patchwork of an environment where some areas have more trees, some areas have fewer trees. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're working on is trying to help an organization, often a community, figure out what is that best balance between trees and the rest of the built environment. We know that for a lot of areas, somewhere between 20 to maybe 40, as much as 50% of your community can be covered by trees. And that can help with things like Darren mentioned, stormwater runoff, all sorts of challenges that we face. And so figuring out kind of where that balance is according to where you're at, a lot easier to have greater tree canopy in an area that gets lots of rainfall. As you head west into a more arid setting, it can be more challenging. And so you may not want as many trees because you don't have as much water available for those trees.
Well, yeah, the species and the density of trees would certainly have to be considered in that. This is fascinating
Exactly.
to me. These are things I've never really thought about. I can understand the shade part right away because with as much asphalt and concrete that we have in cities, my gosh, you have to have some relief. Never put together the fact that the misting cafes and all are mimicking what trees are doing. Absolutely fascinating. That is really, really cool. What are some of the biggest changes that you guys have seen over the course of maybe the last 10, 20 years as it pertains to urban forestry?
Well, on the local level, from my perspective, I think it's awareness. I think many more people are aware of the benefits of trees. I don't know if that's because we're educating our kids better, and so the kids are bringing that home from school, or if it's just media saturation. But whatever we're doing a better job. I also think the management approach versus the arboricultural, let's focus on the forest and not necessarily the individual trees, has made a big difference. And then the third thing, and Paul touched on this a little earlier, is the people aspect, because really that's what makes urban forestry different. If I'm managing a forest in that someone owns a tree farm, okay, I'm dealing with one person. So there's really not a lot of cultural investment or sense of place or any of those kind of ephemeral things that trees bring involved in managing that one forest. But if I'm managing a forest in a city, in parks and zoos and people's yards and along streets and downtown streetscapes, there are a lot more opportunities to involve connections that are made between people and trees than you do in the traditional forestry. Now, that does make it more difficult because, as we all know, a lot of people get into forestry so they don't have to deal with people.
Haven't heard that, but okay.
I've heard
I
that.
can understand.
I've heard that from a lot of folks, and then they end up in urban and community forestry, and they're like, "Wow, I deal with people a lot more than I deal with trees." But looking at because the people are the reason we nurture the tree, so they provide the benefits. If there's no one here, then the benefits aren't really benefiting anyone.
Well, it's certainly understandable for a forester to say that, but then all the foresters I know deal with people on a regular basis, so they may have a misconception of what they're getting into. Paul, what about you? What are some of the changes that you've seen over the last 2 decades?
I agree with Darren. The awareness, take the $1.5 billion investment made through IRA, through the U.S. Forest Service just in this last year, celebrating it this week as the 1-year anniversary of when all of that was kind of announced. We're one of the 12 national pass-through partners, which has created a completely new way of the U.S. Forest Service working with communities across the states. The understanding of the connection between trees and human health is just growing by leaps and bounds. The research that we have that has gone beyond that association to actual causation is just getting better and better year over year. And then also the technology has just grown by leaps and bounds. I think back to just it seems like just a few years ago, but it was a little bit longer than that, when there were organizations investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into establishing what is their tree canopy. And now Google, through AI, has done it for organizations all over the U.S. for free. U.S. Forest Service is working on part of the IRA grant right now where they're going to be establishing that canopy layer for almost all communities across the United States. So we're all going to have that ability to say, oh, I live in a community that has 15% tree canopy versus I live in a community that has 30% tree canopy. And through iTree, one of those suite of softwares that's been developed over the last couple of decades, we can actually put some dollar values to that. But in addition to that, technology like large language models and LiDAR. So the same technology that allows a car to drive itself down the road can be used to go through and do an inventory of your street trees in just a little bit of time, that not only talks about what's the diameter of that trunk and even tell you what the species is, but they could actually tell you how much carbon is really in that tree, because they're not just taking one measurement, they're getting a point cloud that's able to draw out the entire structure of that tree. So we're being able to be more precise, more careful, and yet at the same time, as we get hotter and drier in a lot of areas, it's becoming more challenging as water becomes a more precious resource. We have a lot of areas that are going, okay, well, do we have water for our people, or do we have water for our trees? And so I think it's a great time to be in urban forestry, because we need more people. Put on my career pathways hat for just a moment. We need a greater workforce. We've talked about it for a long time, but it's becoming even more clear that we need more people in more different types of positions than ever before. And so not only is urban forestry good for us from a benefit standpoint, it's also amazing for us from a workforce standpoint. A lot of people don't want to move out into the woods to work, and yet they still want to culture where they're at. We do a lot of work with disadvantaged communities, and if you have a choice between going out into a part of the world that you've never been to before because you don't have that opportunity, you mentioned it earlier, the kids that are in the forest for the first time in their life, it's really hard to get them super excited about going and spending 40 hours a week out there. But if you can help them skill up and get a great job that allows them to literally change the world through planting and caring for trees where they live, where their mom, their grandma, their sister, their daughter is, they can have a huge impact and make a great living at the same time. And so it's just the opportunities are better now than they have been in my entire career.
Do you see more cities creating positions like what Darren has here as urban foresters? I mean, in Louisiana, it seems like there are few. And, we're in a very green state, quite frankly. We have almost 15 million acres of forest in our rural areas, and our cities really seem to be doing better. Do you see that for the future?
Absolutely do. And I think that in areas where trees are less common, you actually see greater investment. It's really easy if all you have to do is drive to the city limits and all of a sudden you're in a forest, to not feel like you have to pay as much attention to the trees inside of that city. But when you start moving out to the other areas, gosh, even if you just drive over to Houston, the investment that Houston has made in the urban forest over the last 25, 30 years is amazing, because we don't really often value something until we've lost it. And then, trees, it takes time. You don't get that little bitty live oak to turn into that big, majestic live oak in just 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I think it really is, we are being more proactive and less reactive. And therefore, cities are investing in their urban forest more.
So with that investment, and we're looking at always new development, Darren, do you take that into account if someone wants to expand maybe a neighborhood or something like that? Is that on the table as far as, okay, you're going to develop it, you want to make sure you have roads, you want to have drainage, you You want to have trees? Is that included in all that plan?
So we do not regulate trees on private residential property, but if you are developing a subdivision in Alexandria, there are some certain trees we call heritage trees that are protected. Now, that does not mean that you can't remove those for the development, but you have to make an effort to integrate those trees into your development. So, but we don't have a lot of that because, I always say context is everything. So Alexandria is really interesting because most of the city has been developed in what was formerly agricultural land, and that's still occurring. Mm-hmm. So we actually end up with more trees. I could argue about the quality of them, but in terms of pure quantity of trees, we have more trees in the developed areas than we do in the undeveloped agricultural areas. But you go across the river to Pineville, which is where I live, it's a completely different landscape over there. That city is in a forest, and to develop anything, you have to cut down trees because it's an upland pine forest versus Alexandria is in an alluvial floodplain. Totally different situation. So, and that presents a challenge for, coming up with kind of boilerplate approaches to how you work with cities because they're all different. So you really have to kind of get in the nuts and the bolts and the history and look at the ecology of not just the city, but the region, mm-hmm. and talk about how that fits in and into your plans.
I would imagine some cultural as well. Paul, you had mentioned that earlier, especially with the work that you do with indigenous people and their properties. So how does SFI work in with that angle?
Indigenous rights and participation is very important to us. Working with all people is really important. So there's a concept that has really come out over the last 5 to 10 years with a term coined by American Forest of tree equity that I think has helped advance the idea that we all deserve the benefits of trees. In a lot of areas across the world, but particularly in the United States and Canada, you can look at those areas in and around a city, and those that are more affluent have more trees. With more trees come more benefits. So there's a big push. The IRA funding that I mentioned was actually funding that they waived the regular 50% match because all of that work was going to be done in areas with disadvantaged communities. And so we're able to make that investment into increasing the canopy in those areas, in better caring for those canopies. It's kind of like if you don't do the maintenance around your house, eventually you're going to get to the point where you're going to have to make a really big investment in new siding, windows, a roof, all sorts of things, all at the same time because you've deferred that annual maintenance. Well, we do the same thing in a lot of communities because urban forestry is often housed in parks, not always, sometimes public works, sometimes planning different areas, but a lot of times it's housed in an area that when money gets tight, it's fairly easy to cut those funds because parks, green space, trees have often been seen as beautification efforts or niceties instead of necessities. We haven't always maintained the investment. But if you think of it from a disaster readiness response and recovery standpoint, when a storm comes through, what causes most of the damage? It's the trees. And the trees, because they are large, because they are outside all the time, they are what the wind tends to affect that then causes damages to people and property. Well, if we are properly maintaining them, they are less likely to fail in a storm. And so I think that's really what we're looking at, is making sure that we're making those investments across the landscape, not just in certain areas. And then when you're starting to look at indigenous people and our tribes, we also have to be particularly cognizant of where they have come from, their perspective. Talking with a group out of the state of Washington right now, and we'll be working with them on a workshop here in the near future. And they don't see the trees as separate. They see the trees as their brothers and sisters, along with a lot of the rest of the natural environment. And so I think that it behooves us to include the learnings that they can provide, and the history, and the kind of a different perspective on what we should, shouldn't, and can do in our environments. And so that's one of the things that we really do require through the standard and therefore certification, is to include indigenous people in participating, recognizing the rights that they have, because it's important for us moving forward.
You had mentioned the I'm trying to remember the exact term that you use, disadvantaged areas in cities, I guess.
Yes.
In an urban area, it's not like being able to replant. I mean, how do you approach an area that could use a better canopy, but you're looking at a lot of concrete, a lot of asphalt, a lot of just buildings, and very little property that's available, or soil that might be available? How do you approach that? How do you expand that?
It can be a real challenge, but in some cases, they are actually going in and removing hardscape in order to be able to have viable planting space. And so I think it is one of those items that is a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. I know a lot of engineers, a lot of people at Public Works, they're problem solvers. And so if you can enlist people in that process of, here, we've set a goal. We want to make sure that we have the trees and the benefits that come from them available for all of us. Here is what we have to work with. What can we do? We also see similar challenges with infill development. I live here in Austin, Texas, and they just increased the ability to subdivide lots because we have a housing crisis also. But what you have to do is make sure that trees are a part of that conversation, because trees, to be successful, need enough space. And so we've got to balance out, okay, do we have high rises with parks that are easily accessible near them? Do we not allow some development because that is green space? When we have new development, do we make sure that there is enough room for trees to be able to give us the life-saving benefits that they do?
Darren, you had wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so a perfect example of that. So in general, you have to be strategic. I liken it to solving a Rubik's Cube, because there's a lot of moving parts. But a perfect example is that in our downtown here in Alexandria, we have recently started redoing our sidewalks, blocks at a time or streets at a time. And the engineers actually came up with this idea. They said, if we could put the crosswalks closer to the center of the street and not have parking on the corners, it would would solve this grading issue that we have with Americans for Disabilities Act. But we can't figure out what to do with this extra space that we're creating where we're taking out parking lots. And I said, well, what if we planted trees in there? So they're called bulb outs or bump outs. And in some cities you see them on corners, and you can also do them in, at mid-block crossings, but you really don't lose, because no one parks on the corners anyway. It's just wasted space. And so
I'd beg to differ. I've seen lots of
you
people in Alexandria do that, but they also yield and not stop at stop signs. But that's another conversation. Sorry,
you shouldn't park on corners.
Yeah.
But what it does is it creates these really nice, 10 by 10 or 10 by 15 spaces for trees, which that creates enough space to plant a really good sized tree. So we've kind of abandoned the old timey tree pits, the 3x3 tree coffins, and we're kind of converting to this bulb out. But look, if you ride through cities, even in cities that have a lot of paving, and there are places for trees, people just haven't looked for them, and they haven't tried, because there is a lot of concrete and a lot of asphalt that the only reason it's there is so they don't have to mow, or because that's just the way they did it back then. So there is plenty of room. You just have to be strategic in finding it. And then, as Paul said, making sure that you match the growing space with the tree.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting too. Paul had mentioned about, maintenance and things of that nature. When you do something like this, there are huge benefits, but there's also an added cost as far as maintenance is concerned. How big of a challenge has that been over the years?
Interestingly, the trees are, as a landscape architect, I have designed a lot of landscapes, and trees are the biggest bang for your buck. Yes, they do require maintenance, but if you look at the amount of biomass that they produce based on the investment, it's minimal. And yes, there are maintenance costs on trees just like there are on your car. But if they are beneficial and if they are necessary, then we have to figure out a way to pay for those.
Paul, is that a challenge in your experience?
It absolutely is, because there hasn't been an understanding of the accounting process. Trees don't fit into a quarterly accounting report very well. Trees can take years, decades to see those main benefits. But you can look at something as simple as the shade from a tree can extend the life of the pavement on the road. And so, yes, there are expenses to maintaining that tree, but if you could do the full accounting of the improved health of the people that live there, the savings on energy by not having to run your air conditioner as much, the lengthening of the time that the road and the sidewalk last before you have to resurface it, all of these different things, every research study that I have seen shows that trees are an investment, which means that the money that you spend putting them in and caring for them is more than offset by those benefits that we get from them. But if the city manager, if the city council, the mayor don't understand that, then it's easy to say, oh, well, there's a line item that we can reduce because we can go a couple of years without pruning the trees and none of our voters are complaining about it. Then you have to increase that maintenance budget later because maybe they start dropping limbs or the storm comes through and trees come down that would have otherwise. And so I think it is one of the challenges that people like Darren and I have really faced over these last couple of decades is helping more and more people really understand what trees mean to us so that we are willing to invest in them.
I think there are times when the maintenance is looked at because a tree has been planted in the wrong place and it's maybe disturbing the asphalt or the sidewalk or things of that nature. So is that more of an education standpoint that, yeah, it shouldn't have been planted there in the first place. Let's find a better place for that.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research in soil volume requirements for trees, and that, as I mentioned before, the tree coffins or tree pits were very common in the 70s and 80s, and the thought was, well, if you plant a tree in a small space, it will stay small, but it will not. The trees are they're colonizers. That's what they do in nature, and that's what they do in urban areas. So they will find a crack in the sidewalk or the street or the parking lot, and they will exploit that. They will open that paving up, which allows more oxygen and water in, and it's just a cumulative effect over time. So they will either die, they will or they will find a way to live. And so, yeah, matching the right tree to the right place and balancing, do we want 40 trees that are small, or do we want 20 trees that are large, and which one is better, and what do the people want? And so it's like a Rubik's Cube.
You have to figure out where the right tree goes and how much space you're going to have to have it grow and continue without disturbing other projects.
Correct.
Okay. Paul, what have we not talked
particularly
about?
When you add in utility lines.
Oh,
That's a big one. And reliability of our electricity is extremely important. There are a lot of people that literally their life depends upon the electricity running. And you don't have to be on a respirator or something to be that. When we're dealing with the temperatures that we're dealing with in the South and across the country, electricity is really important. So making sure that you can have reliable service and trees takes some planning. Darren was absolutely right. You have to be strategic about it. That's why I think planners in cities are great allies for urban forests, because planners think in terms of decades. They don't just think about what are we doing this month, what are we doing this quarter, not even just this year. They are looking at a longer term frame. And so you've got to be able to find who are your allies in a community that can help you say the right things to the right people.
Paul, what have we not talked about today that from SFI's standpoint, urban forestry information is vital for people to learn?
The one thing that I really think is important for everybody to know is the connection between trees, our forests, and our health. There is getting to be I mentioned it a couple of times, but there's a specific project called the Green Heart Project out of Kentucky, really kind of initiated by the Nature Conservancy. And I think they did something in their proof of concept that was really important, which has led to something that will be just as or more important. So as a proof of concept, they put air quality monitoring stations around an elementary school, measured the air quality up until the day they planted the trees. Now, they planted larger, rough-leafed evergreen trees. They planted them on one day, and the very next day, the air quality at that school improved. So that was the proof of concept, which has now led to a randomized controlled trial to plant trees as a health improvement intervention that is ongoing, and I think will be one of those really important next steps in us being able to get people to think about trees as the investment that they are, as something that is vital for our sustainability. A lot of people talk about trees making communities livable. Trees actually make communities survivable. If you think about it, everywhere there are people and they start to gather in a group, they start planting trees. That's because we are so intricately connected to them. There's research that shows that infant birth weights go down in areas that have lost trees, that cardiovascular pulmonary disease goes up in areas that have lost trees. Dr. Jeffrey Donovan, researcher, economist with the U.S. Forest Service, took a sabbatical and went to New Zealand because they have a more robust public health record system than we have in the United States. And he was able to identify cohorts of youth, kids, and follow them through their lives and be able to map out the greenness of where they lived and where they went to school, and saw that things like ADHD went down or was lower for those that lived in and went to school in greener areas. So all of these things are just one really important highlight of how important trees and forests are. Once we know they're important, then we know that we can invest in them, which leads to the standard as the first and so far the only sector developed standard in the world that says, okay, here's a roadmap. You don't have to know everything, but here are the 16 objectives, the performance measures, the indicators that we each need to pay some attention to do a better job of being stewards for this resource that does so many great things for us. And then the other really important thing is the third-party certification that is a part of it. The standard is freely available for everyone to use. We already have consultants building it into urban forest master plans, management plans for communities, those kinds of things. But that next step is having a third party come in and audit your program so that you can tell your voters, your shareholders if you're a corporation, your staff, your students if you're a college, that we care about you, and here is the proof that we are managing our urban forest to better care for you. And I think it's a brand new concept for urban and community forestry, so it will take a little while for it to really sink in and be valued, since there's often not a product to put a logo on at the end. But it is one of those next big steps in the evolution of urban and community forestry as a profession.
Paul, if there's anyone out there listening to you and thinking, well, my city probably should do something about that, can they contact you?
Absolutely. Our email addresses are easy. It's first name dot last name at forest.org. So paul.johnson@forest.org. I love our website title. And then if they'd love to know more about the urban standard, you can go to forest.org/urban standard. And that will get you to all sorts of information. We are just about to launch a urban forest improvement grant, which will help organizations, specifically towns and cities, colleges, tribes, utilize the urban standard to assess where their urban forest is in relationship to that. And so we'll have up to $29,500 available for urban forests that include disadvantaged communities to either do it in-house or hire a consultant to come in and help them kind of benchmark where they are and identify those areas where they're doing a great job and those areas where they could focus their next improvement.
If you didn't catch that, don't worry. I will have Paul's contact information in the show notes so you can look there and get that. Darren, if there are maybe some colleagues that you're unaware of and they have programs they want to contact you, can they?
Certainly. Darren.Green at cityofalex.com.
Very good. Any closing statements from you, Darren?
I would just encourage listeners, if you live in a city or town or community that doesn't seem to manage their trees, the best way to get them to do it is to point out that they're not doing it. And I have found in my 23 years of working for a municipality that it's really odd that if you ask for something in a group of 4 or 5 people, you will typically get it. If you keep asking, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So I would encourage people to get involved in their communities and demand that we take better care of our trees. As you said it in the beginning of the show, Louisiana is not known for its urban forestry programs, and there are a lot of reasons for that that we can't go into today. But a lot of it is just because people don't ask for it. We have a program in Alexandria because of a catastrophe that happened with a hazard tree, and because of how that went down, a program was created 30 years ago, and now we have all the benefits of that. So I encourage people to get involved, because that's where it really happens, at the grassroots level.
Darren Green, he's the landscape architect and urban forester for the city of Alexandria, Louisiana. And Paul Johnson, who is the vice president of urban and community forestry for SFI. And, I didn't want to forget career pathways as well. That's another aspect of what you do. Isn't that right, Paul?
It is indeed.
Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you on Minding the Forest. Thank you for listening to Mind of the Forest. This episode was sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit office, or you can find them online at firstsouthland.com. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and forest products industry in Louisiana, check out our website at laforestry.com. You can send comments or suggestions to me by email at jzeringue@laforestry.com. That's jzeringue@laforestry.com. You also can check out the show notes for our contact information, and we'll also include the contact information of our guests in this episode. You can subscribe to Mind of the Forest by clicking on the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and be sure to tap the notification button as well so you'll know when a new episode drops each month. Thank you for doing that. We really do appreciate it. And remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're Mind of the Forest for you.